Stay with us for the night. The German girl begged the black soldier to stay. April 23rd, 1945. 1400 hours. Wetzlar, Germany. The acrid smell of burning wood mixed with cordite hung in the air as 20-year-old Helene Müller pressed herself against the cellar wall, her hands trembling. Above her, the sound of American voices speaking English cut through the silence that had replaced the artillery thunder. The war had finally reached her small Hessian town, and everything she had been taught to believe about the enemy was about to be tested. Through the narrow cellar window, she watched American boots moving through the rubble of what had been her neighbor's bakery. These were the soldiers Nazi propaganda had warned about for years. The broadcasts had been specific and terrifying. American forces, particularly their Negro troops, were described as savages without culture or mercy. Goebbels himself had warned German women in a February broadcast that capture meant certain brutality. The cellar door burst open. Sunlight flooded down the stone steps, silhouetting two American soldiers. Helene's breath caught in her throat. One of them was a black man, wearing sergeant stripes on his sleeve. Every warning she had ever heard crashed through her mind at once. This was the moment Nazi propaganda had prepared her for. This was when the lies would be proven true, or everything would shatter. Sergeant Henry Lawson descended the stairs slowly, his rifle pointed downward. At 32 years old, he had seen enough war to recognize terror in a young woman's eyes. He had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where white fear looked different but sounded the same. The girl against the wall was maybe 20, blonde hair matted with dust, her blue eyes wide with something beyond simple fear. This was existential dread. "Kommen Sie hier," he said in broken German, gesturing upward. "Come here." His accent was terrible, but the meaning was clear. Helene did not move. She had heard stories. Every German girl had heard stories. The radio broadcasts from Berlin had been explicit about what happened to women captured by American forces. Henry lowered his rifle completely and removed his helmet. "Ma'am, we're not going to hurt you," he said in English, knowing she probably could not understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey what grammar could not. "We're here to help." The other soldier, Private Thomas Keller, stepped forward with a canteen. He was younger, maybe 24, with kind eyes that reminded Helene briefly of her brother Klaus, who had died at Stalingrad 3 years earlier. Thomas extended the canteen toward her. Helene stared at it. This was wrong. Everything about... Before you continue listening, please let me know, where in the world are you watching from today? Now back to the story. This moment contradicted what she had been taught. Enemy soldiers did not offer water. They took everything. They destroyed. They brutalized. Yet here was this young American private holding out drinking water to a German prisoner. Her throat was so dry it hurt. She had not drunk anything since yesterday morning. The town's water supply had been cut off during the shelling. She reached out slowly, expecting the canteen to be pulled away at the last second, some cruel joke. Instead, Thomas placed it gently in her hand. The water was cool and clean. Helene drank deeply, and something inside her began to crack. Not break, not yet, but crack. The first fissure in everything she had been taught to believe. Henry watched her drink and saw something he recognized. He had seen it in the mirror often enough back home. The look of someone whose worldview was colliding with reality. Someone who had been told they were less than human, facing humans who refused to play the role assigned to them. "What's your name?" he asked, knowing she would not understand, but needing to establish something beyond captor and prisoner. Helene lowered the canteen. "Helene Müller," she whispered. April 23rd, 1945, 1600 hours. American processing camp, Wetzlar outskirts. The temporary prisoner compound occupied what had been a Hitler Youth training facility 3 months earlier. Now, American flags hung where swastika banners once dominated. Helene stood among 37 other German civilians, mostly women and elderly men, waiting to be registered and assigned quarters. The American efficiency shocked her. German military organization was legendary in propaganda films, but this was something different. Soldiers moved with purpose, but without cruelty. They checked identification papers, took photographs, and processed each prisoner in less than 5 minutes. At this rate, they handled more people in an hour than the local government office processed in a week. When Helene reached the front of the line, Sergeant Lawson was waiting. She had not expected to see him again. In her mind, soldiers captured prisoners and moved on to the next battle. But Henry had specifically requested assignment as her supervising guard. The Army's processing system allowed sergeants to claim responsibility for specific prisoners, particularly when language or special circumstances required continuity of care. Helene Mueller, he read from the paper she had been given, his pronunciation mangling her surname into something that sounded like Miller. "That's you?" She nodded, understanding his meaning, if not his exact words. An interpreter, a middle-aged German man who wore an American armband, stepped forward. "The sergeant wants to know if you have family in the area, if they need to be located or notified." Helene's voice cracked. "My mother and sister. They're in our house on Bahnhofstrasse, number 17, the house with the green shutters." She paused, then added desperately, "There's a photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. It's all we have left of my father and brother." "Please." The interpreter translated. Henry listened, then spoke to Thomas Keller, who had followed them from the cellar. The young private nodded and headed toward a jeep. Helene watched, confused and frightened. What were they planning? Were they going to arrest her mother and sister too? 30 minutes later, Thomas returned. He carried a silver frame containing a photograph of the Müller family, taken in 1938, when the world still made sense. Father in his postal worker uniform, mother smiling. Klaus at 15, before the Wehrmacht took him. Little Greta at 12, before the food shortages made her old before her time. And Helene herself at 14, still believing in the future. Thomas handed her the photograph. "Your mother and sister are safe," the interpreter translated. "They are being processed for relocation to housing. The sergeant wanted you to have this." Helene stared at the photograph, then at Henry. She could not speak. The words would not come. Nazi propaganda had prepared her for torture, rape, execution. No one had prepared her for kindness from the enemy. No one had explained what to do when your captors treated you with more humanity than your own government had shown in years. That night, in the converted barracks that housed female prisoners, Helene could not sleep. The building held 43 women on simple cots with clean blankets. American soldiers guarded the doors but did not enter. Hot soup had been served at 1800 hours. Real potato soup with bits of meat. More food than she had seen in a single meal in 6 months. Around her, other women whispered. Some cried. Others prayed. Many spoke of what they expected tomorrow would bring. The Americans were being kind now, they said, but tomorrow the true treatment would begin. Tomorrow the propaganda would be proven right. Tonight was just psychological warfare to break their spirits. Helene clutched the photograph to her chest. She thought about Sergeant Lawson's face when he listened to her request. She remembered Private Keller's kindness with the canteen. She recalled the hot soup and clean blankets. Maybe tomorrow everything would change. maybe the cruelty would begin. But tonight, clutching her family photograph recovered by enemy soldiers, Helene Müller began to suspect that everything she had been taught might be a lie. April 24th, 1945, 0700 hours. The morning sun cut through the barracks window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light. Helene woke to the sound of American trucks rumbling past the compound, carrying supplies toward the front lines that had already moved 50 miles east. The war was rushing away from Wetzlar, leaving only occupation and uncertainty in its wake. Breakfast appeared at 0730. American soldiers wheeled in metal containers filled with oatmeal, powdered eggs, bread, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz mixture of barley and acorns that Germans had been drinking since 1942. The aroma alone was almost painful in its richness. Helena accepted her portion in a metal tray and found a place to sit among the other women. Frau Weber, a 58-year-old widow whose husband had died in the first week of the invasion of Poland, sat beside her. "They're fattening us up," she whispered, stirring her oatmeal suspiciously. "Like pigs before slaughter. Don't trust it." But Helena noticed something that contradicted Frau Weber's fear. The American soldiers ate the same food. She watched through the window as guards on break sat on wooden crates, eating from identical metal trays. Their oatmeal looked the same. Their bread came from the same loaves. If this was poison or some elaborate deception, the Americans were remarkably committed to the performance. At 0900 hours, Sergeant Lawson appeared at the barracks door. He spoke to the guard, then gestured for Helena to come outside. The interpreter was not present. Fear flickered through her chest. This was the moment the other women had predicted. This was when the facade would drop. Henry led her across the compound to what had been the commandant's office in the Hitler Youth Facility. Inside, the room had been stripped of Nazi paraphernalia, leaving only a desk, 2 chairs, and the map of Germany on the wall with pins marking American advance positions. He gestured for her to sit. From his jacket pocket, Henry produced a chocolate bar. Hershey's. The brown wrapper looked impossibly exotic. He broke it in half and offered her a piece. Helena stared at it. She had not seen chocolate in 3 years. Real chocolate had vanished from German shops in 1942, replaced by a substance made from sugar beets and sawdust that no one pretended actually tasted like chocolate. She took it carefully, as if it might disappear. The first bite melted on her tongue, sweet and rich and real. Tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. Not from fear, not from relief, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition of how much had been taken from her country, from her life, from her childhood. Henry ate his half of the chocolate bar and watched her cry. He understood something about deprivation that most white American soldiers did not. He had grown up in Birmingham during the Depression, in a neighborhood where being black meant being last in line for everything. He knew what it meant to go without, not because of war, but because of who you were. "My mama used to save up for months to buy us kids 1 chocolate bar at Christmas," he said in English, knowing she could not understand the words, but needing to say them anyway. "We'd divide it into pieces so small you could barely taste it. Make it last all day." Funny how chocolate can mean so much. Helena looked at him through her tears. She understood nothing of his words, but everything of his tone. This man knew something about suffering, something about loss, something that connected them across the impossible gulf of language, nationality, and everything the war had tried to teach them about each other. Henry reached into his other pocket and produced a handkerchief. Clean, pressed, white cotton. He handed it to her. Helene took it and wiped her eyes, ashamed of her tears and confused by their cause. Outside, the sound of American soldiers singing drifted through the window. They were loading trucks with supplies, singing something with a rhythm that sounded almost like the work songs her father used to sing in their garden. Different words, different melody, but the same human need to make hard work bearable with music. Helene folded the handkerchief carefully and tried to return it. Henry shook his head and closed her fingers over it. "Keep it," he said, the universal gesture making his meaning clear. That afternoon, sitting in the barracks with the other women, Helene kept the handkerchief folded in her pocket. She did not mention the chocolate or the conversation without words, but something was changing inside her, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. April 24th, 1945. 2000 hours. Darkness had settled over the compound like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the spring chill that made the thin barracks walls feel even thinner. Helene lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to 42 other women breathing in various states of sleep. Some snored softly. Others whimpered through dreams that were probably closer to nightmares. The war might have moved east, but it still lived in their minds. She could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, images crowded in. The chocolate bar, the handkerchief, Sergeant Lawson's face when he broke the chocolate in half, offering it without hesitation. Private Keller retrieving her family photograph, as if it mattered that a German girl might want something so simple as a picture of her dead father and brother. The propaganda broadcasts played in her memory like a phonograph stuck in a groove. Dr. Goebbels' voice, urgent and certain, warning that American soldiers were barbarians, that their Negro troops in particular were animals in uniform, creatures without civilization or restraint. She had heard these broadcasts hundreds of times since 1942, at school assemblies, at Hitler Youth meetings, from the radio in their kitchen. But propaganda could not explain Sergeant Lawson's eyes. They were tired eyes, old eyes in a young face. The kind of eyes her father had developed during the Depression years, when work disappeared and dignity became a luxury. These were not the eyes of an animal. These were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and still chose kindness. A sound outside the barracks made her sit up. Footsteps, heavy boots on gravel. The other women stirred nervously. Night was when the worst fears came alive, when imagination turned every sound into a threat. The door opened slowly, spilling lamplight across the wooden floor. Sergeant Lawson stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. Behind him stood the interpreter, the middle-aged German man with the American armband. Several women gasped. This was it, their faces said. This was when the pretense ended. Helena Müller, the interpreter called softly. The sergeant needs to speak with you. Please come. Helene's heart hammered against her ribs. Frau Weber grabbed her wrist. Don't go, she whispered urgently. Tell them you're sick. Tell them anything. But Helene stood. She did not know why. Perhaps because refusing seemed more dangerous than complying. Perhaps because something in Henry's posture suggested this was not what Frau Weber feared. She walked to the door, aware of every woman's eyes on her back. Outside, the cool night air cleared her head. Henry dismissed the interpreter with a few words. The man hesitated, then nodded and walked back toward the main building. Now it was just the two of them, standing in the lamplight that spilled from the barracks door. Henry gestured for her to walk with him. They moved slowly along the gravel path that circled the compound, staying within the perimeter marked by the guard towers. American soldiers watched from their posts but did not interfere. Above them, stars emerged between scattered clouds, The same stars that shone over Birmingham and Berlin, over America and Germany, indifferent to the borders men drew beneath them. They walked in silence for several minutes. Finally, Henry stopped near a bench that overlooked what had been a parade ground. He sat down and patted the space beside him. Helene sat carefully, maintaining distance, still uncertain of everything. Henry spoke in English, his voice low and steady. "I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. That's in the South. You don't know what that means, but I'll tell you anyway because I need to say it out loud. In Birmingham, there were separate water fountains for white folks and colored folks. Separate schools, separate churches, separate everything. The white folks said it was because we were less than human. They had newspapers and radio shows that said we were animals, dangerous, violent, inferior." Helene understood none of the words, but she understood the tone. Pain, anger, but also something else, a kind of weary recognition. "The U.S. Army is segregated," Henry continued. "Even here, fighting for freedom, we're kept separate. White soldiers get the good assignments. We get the dirty work. But you know what? I signed up anyway. Because somebody has to show them we're human. Somebody has to prove the propaganda wrong." He turned to look at her. In the lamplight, his face was gentle but sad. "You're scared of me because somebody told you to be scared. Somebody who never met me, who doesn't know my mama taught me to read from the Bible, who doesn't know I wanted to be a teacher before the war. Somebody just told you I was a monster, and you believed them." Helene met his eyes. She understood nothing of his words, but everything of his meaning. This man was trying to tell her something important, something about the lies both of them had been told. "Stay with me for the night," she said, suddenly in German, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Bleib bei mir für die Nacht." April 24th, 1945, 2100 hours. The words hung in the night air between them like something physical. Helene's face flushed hot with embarrassment and confusion. She had not meant to say it. Or perhaps she had, but had not realized until the words escaped. "Stay with me for the night." It sounded improper, scandalous, dangerous. Everything she had been taught about propriety screamed that this was wrong. But Henry understood something deeper than the words themselves. He had grown up watching fear in people's eyes. He knew the difference between the fear of danger and the fear of being alone with your thoughts. This young German girl was not making an improper proposition. She was asking not to be abandoned to the darkness and her own mind. "All right," he said softly, though she could not understand the English word. He made no move to leave the bench. Instead, he leaned back and looked up at the stars. "I'll stay right here." Helene pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. The night was cold, and the jacket was inadequate, but she barely noticed. Relief flooded through her so powerfully it was almost painful. She was not going to be alone with the voices in her head, with the crumbling edifice of everything she had believed. They sat in silence for a while. Then Henry began to speak again, his voice barely above a whisper. He did not expect her to understand. He was speaking for himself as much as for her. Sometimes you had to say things out loud to make them real, even if no one else could understand the words. "My son is 4 years old," he said, staring at the stars. "His name is James. I haven't seen him in 14 months. My wife, Sarah, writes me letters, tells me how he's growing, how he asks about me every night before bed. She sends pictures, but they're never enough. You can't hug a photograph. He paused, pulling a worn photograph from his breast pocket. In the lamplight from the distant barracks, Helene could see a beautiful woman with a warm smile, holding a small boy who had his father's eyes. When I get home, James will be 5. I'll have missed his 4th birthday, his first day at the colored school, his first time riding a bicycle. All because men who've never met me decided that people across an ocean needed to die. All because somebody convinced everybody that their way was the only way, that some people were superior and others were inferior. Helene watched his face as he spoke. She caught one word that sounded familiar. Son, he had said. Sohn in German. She understood that much. This man had a child. This supposed monster had a family waiting for him somewhere across the ocean. Henry carefully returned the photograph to his pocket, directly over his heart. You know what's funny? Not ha-ha funny, but strange funny? The same country that makes me drink from different water fountains, that makes my son go to a different school because of the color of his skin, that country sent me here to fight for freedom. Freedom for white folks in Europe, while colored folks back home don't have it. He turned to look at Helene. But I fight anyway. You want to know why? Because somebody has to break the cycle. Somebody has to prove that treating people like humans works better than treating them like animals. Somebody has to show that kindness is stronger than cruelty. The sound of singing drifted across the compound. American soldiers in one of the buildings were harmonizing on a gospel song. The melody was rich and complex, filled with the kind of longing and hope that transcends language. Helene recognized the emotion, if not the words. It was the same longing she heard in the church hymns back home, the same hope that maybe tomorrow would be better than today. Henry listened to the singing and smiled slightly. That's the 3rd Platoon boys. Most of them are from Georgia. They sing every night before lights out. Drives some of the white officers crazy, but they don't stop it because morale is morale. He stood up slowly and stretched. Come on, I'll walk you back to the barracks. I'll stay outside until morning. You're safe. I promise you that. As they walked back along the gravel path, Helene felt something shifting inside her. It was not a dramatic change, not a sudden conversion. It was more like a small crack in a dam. Water had not burst through yet, but the pressure was building. Everything she had been taught was pressing against everything she was experiencing, and the structure was beginning to fail. At the barracks door, Henry nodded to her. She nodded back. No words were necessary. She went inside and returned to her cot. Through the window, she could see him taking up position on a wooden crate near the door, settling in for a long night of guard duty. Frau Weber hissed from the darkness. What did he do to you? Helene pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. Nothing, she whispered back. He told me about his son, and he promised I was safe. You're a fool to believe an enemy soldier. But Helene was not sure anymore who the enemy was. The Americans who gave her chocolate and guarded her sleep, or the system that had taught her to fear them. As she finally drifted toward sleep, she was no longer certain of anything, except that tomorrow would bring more questions that her Nazi education had never prepared her to answer. April 25, 1945, 0900 hours, Wetzlar Processing Camp. The morning sun revealed what darkness had hidden. The compound was larger than Helene had realized, housing approximately 300 German civilians across 6 converted barracks. American soldiers moved through the camp with practiced efficiency, distributing supplies, coordinating work details, and maintaining order without the brutality Nazi propaganda had promised. Helene watched from the doorway of her barracks as Private Thomas Keller approached, carrying a wooden crate. He was 23 years old, from a small town in Iowa called Cedar Rapids. She would learn these details later, but this morning she knew only that he was the young soldier who had retrieved her family photograph. Thomas set the crate down and opened it. Inside were blankets, new wool blankets, still in their military wrapping. He counted out 43 of them, one for each woman in the barracks. The spring nights were cold, and the thin cotton blankets they had been issued were inadequate. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to requisition better supplies. "For you," Thomas said, in heavily accented German, distributing the blankets. His pronunciation was terrible, mangling the words into something barely recognizable. But the gesture needed no translation. Frau Weber accepted her blanket with suspicious silence. Others murmured quiet thanks. Helene took hers and felt the weight of it, the substantial warmth. This was not the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. This was generosity. At 1000 hours, American medics arrived to conduct health screenings. Helene had expected this to be invasive, humiliating. Instead, it was professional and respectful. A female nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell from Philadelphia, examined each woman in a partitioned area that provided privacy. She checked for injuries, infections, malnutrition. When she discovered that Helene had a persistent cough from weeks of sleeping in cold, damp cellars, she provided actual medicine, sulfa tablets, the same medicine American soldiers received. "Take 1 tablet 3 times daily with water," Lieutenant Mitchell explained through an interpreter. "The cough should clear in 5 days. If it doesn't, come find me immediately." Helene stared at the small envelope containing 15 tablets. Medicine in Germany had been scarce since 1942. Civilian hospitals ran out of basic supplies monthly. Doctors performed surgery without anesthesia. People died from infections that penicillin could cure because penicillin existed only in laboratories and military hospitals. Yet, here was an American nurse giving medicine to an enemy prisoner for something as minor as a cough. That afternoon, work details were organized. The American Army needed help processing supplies, sorting equipment, and maintaining the camp. Helene volunteered for the kitchen detail, hoping that working would quiet the constant noise in her head. She was assigned to help prepare the evening meal alongside 3 other German women and 2 American soldiers. The kitchen was a revelation. Industrial stoves that worked, running water, both hot and cold, refrigeration units keeping food fresh. The supplies seemed endless. Potatoes, carrots, onions, actual beef. Not the ersatz substitutes Germans had eaten for years, but real ingredients. Corporal James Washington, a black soldier from Georgia, supervised the kitchen with easy competence. He showed them how to operate the equipment, communicated through gestures when words failed, and worked alongside them rather than simply giving orders. At one point, he caught Helene staring at the quantity of food they were preparing. He smiled and said something in English that the interpreter later translated. "Don't worry, there's always enough. Nobody goes hungry in an American camp." The evening meal that night fed 300 people with food left over. In Germany, that same quantity of ingredients would have been stretched to feed 1,000, and still people would have gone to bed with empty stomachs. Helene had lived through 5 years of ration cards, of waiting in lines for bread, of her mother crying over spoiled potatoes because they were all the family had. This casual abundance was incomprehensible. After dinner, Sergeant Lawson found her sitting outside the kitchen, watching the sun set. He sat down beside her on the wooden bench, maintaining a respectful distance. They did not speak. There was no interpreter present, and neither knew enough of the other's language for conversation. But silence between them had become comfortable. Not the tense silence of enemies, but the quiet of two people who had begun to recognize each other as human. As darkness fell, Henry pulled something from his pocket. A small photograph, worn soft at the edges from being carried and handled. He showed it to Helene. A woman and a young boy, the same photograph he had shown her the night before. But this time he pointed to himself, then to the boy, and made a gesture that suggested growth, time passing. Helene understood. This was his son. This man guarding her, showing her kindness, had a child waiting for him somewhere across the ocean. The propaganda had never mentioned that enemy soldiers had families, had children, had lives beyond the battlefield. April 26, 1945, 1400 hours. The camp's central courtyard had been converted into a gathering space where prisoners could spend their afternoon hours. Wooden tables and benches occupied the area where Hitler Youth had once performed synchronized drills. Now, German civilians sat in small groups, talking quietly, mending clothes, or simply existing in the strange liminal space between war and whatever came next. Helene sat alone at a table, trying to write a letter to her mother and sister. Paper and pencil had been provided by the American authorities. Mail service existed even for prisoners. The Red Cross coordinated it, ensuring that families could communicate across the ruins of Germany. But Helene's pencil hovered over the blank page, unable to find words that could explain what she was experiencing. How could she describe the abundance, the kindness, the slow crumbling of everything she had been taught to believe? Her mother had survived the First World War, had lived through the Depression, had raised her children on Nazi promises of German greatness. What words existed to tell her that those promises were lies, that the enemy was more humane than the government they had trusted? "Mind if I join you?" The voice came from above. Helene looked up to find Sergeant Lawson standing with a metal cup of coffee in each hand. An interpreter, a young German woman named Anna, who worked for the Americans, stood beside him. "The sergeant asks if you would like some coffee," Anna translated. "Real coffee, not ersatz." Helene nodded, and Henry set one cup in front of her before sitting down across the table. The coffee was hot and rich, the aroma alone worth more than words. She wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. Henry spoke, and Anna translated. "I wanted to tell you something about where I come from, about Birmingham. You need to understand something about America to understand me." Helene listened as Henry described growing up in Alabama, the Jim Crow laws that governed every aspect of black life, the separate schools that received the oldest textbooks, the broken desks, the teachers who worked for half the salary of white teachers, the water fountains marked colored and white, the restaurants that would not serve him, the buses where he had to sit in the back. "When I was 7 years old," Henry said, and Anna translated with careful attention to his tone, "my father took me to town to buy shoes. The white shoe store wouldn't let us try shoes on inside. They made us stand outside on the sidewalk. My father had money. He could pay. But we weren't allowed inside because of our skin color." Helene listened, the coffee cooling in her hands. This was not what Nazi propaganda had taught her about America. Goebbels' broadcasts had focused on American weakness, American degeneracy, American Jewish control. They had never mentioned that America had its own system of oppression, its own hierarchy of human worth. "My mother cleaned houses for white families," Henry continued. "She raised their children, cooked their food, washed their clothes. But she had to use the back door. She couldn't eat at their table. She couldn't use their bathroom. At the end of the day, they paid her less than they would pay a white woman for the same work. Anna translated carefully, watching Helene's face. The young German woman was struggling to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about America. "Why did you join the army?" Helene asked through Anna. "If your own country treats you this way, why fight for it?" Henry smiled, but it was a sad smile. "That's the question everyone asks. My mama asked it when I enlisted. She cried. She said America didn't deserve her son's service." He paused, looking down at his coffee. "But I joined anyway, because I believed something. I believed that if colored men proved ourselves in combat, showed we could fight and die for America, maybe things would change back home. Maybe we could earn the respect we'd been denied." "Has it changed?" Helene asked. "Not yet," Henry admitted through Anna's translation. "I'm still in a segregated unit. White soldiers still get better treatment. But something has shifted. We've proven we can fight. We've shown we're just as brave, just as capable. That has to mean something." Helene thought about this. Here was a man fighting for a country that discriminated against him, hoping that his sacrifice would buy freedom for his son. It was not so different from what Germans had been told. Fight for the fatherland, sacrifice for the future, die for something greater than yourself. But the Americans had not lied about their enemy to motivate their soldiers. They had told the truth about Germany's crimes. "The Hitler Youth taught us that inferior races existed," Helene said slowly, and Anna translated. "They taught us that Germans were superior, that Slavs were subhuman, that Jews were parasites, that black people were animals." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I believed them. I'm ashamed, but I believed them." Henry reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture was gentle, almost brotherly. Propaganda works because it tells you what you want to hear. It makes you feel special, chosen, superior. It gives simple answers to complicated questions. You were a child when it started. You didn't choose to be indoctrinated. Tears welled in Helene's eyes. "But I should have known. I should have questioned." "How?" Henry asked. "When questioning meant death? When everyone around you believed the same lies? You were trapped in a system designed to stop people from thinking." April 27th, 1945, 1800 hours. The sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the evening quiet. Helene was in the mess hall with other prisoners eating dinner. Beef stew with actual beef, bread with real butter, vegetables that had not been preserved in suspicious-smelling brine. The routine of meals had become almost normal in 4 days, but the urgency in the American soldiers' movements suggested something had changed. Sergeant Lawson appeared at the mess hall entrance. He scanned the room until his eyes found Helene. He gestured for her to come. Fear spiked through her chest. Had something happened to her mother? Her sister? She set down her spoon and walked quickly to the door. Outside, a military ambulance sat in the courtyard. Medics were unloading a stretcher. On it lay a German officer, his uniform torn and bloody. As they carried him past, Helene's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the face beneath the dirt and blood. Hauptmann Werner Brandt, her former superior from the Reich Labor Service. Helene had served 6 months in the labor service in 1943. Every German girl over 17 was required to serve. They worked in munitions factories, in fields, in hospitals. Hauptmann Brandt had commanded her unit. He was a true believer, a party member since 1933, A man who saw the world in absolutes of German superiority and racial hierarchy. Henry noticed her reaction. Through Anna, who had followed them outside, he asked, "You know this man?" "Yes," Helene whispered. "He was my commanding officer in the labor service." The medics carried Brandt into the camp's medical facility. Henry followed, and Helene found herself following too, drawn by something she could not name. Perhaps it was the need to see what had become of the world she had left behind. Perhaps it was morbid curiosity. Perhaps it was the hope that Brandt, seeing her, might tell her she had not betrayed everything by accepting American kindness. Inside the medical tent, Lieutenant Mitchell and her team worked efficiently. Brandt had taken shrapnel to his chest and leg. The wounds were serious, but not fatal. As the medics cut away his uniform and began cleaning the wounds, Brandt's eyes opened. They focused slowly, taking in the American medical equipment, the American personnel, and finally, Helene standing near the entrance. Recognition flickered across his face. Then contempt. "Mullah," he said, his voice weak but venomous. "I should have known I would find a traitor here. Comfortable with the enemy. Fed and clean, while Germany burns." Helene flinched as if struck. The words cut deeper than any physical blow. She stepped forward, compelled by some instinct to defend herself, to explain. "Hauptmann, I am a prisoner. I did not choose this." "Didn't you?" Brandt's lips curled into a sneer. "You look well fed. You look clean. You stand here without shackles, without guards. How many favors have you traded for such comfort, Muller? What have you given these animals?" The accusation was clear. The implication was sickening. Helene felt her face burn with shame and rage. "I have given nothing. They have shown mercy. They have treated us with humanity." Brandt tried to sit up, but Lieutenant Mitchell pushed him firmly back down. "Humanity from subhumans," he spat. "You always were weak, Muller. Your brother died for Germany. Your father served the Reich faithfully. And you shame their memory by accepting charity from our enemies." Helene's hands trembled. She fumbled at her pocket and pulled out a canteen of water. Despite everything, despite the cruelty in his words, she could not watch him suffer. She approached his stretcher and held out the canteen. "Please, drink." Brandt looked at the canteen, then at her face. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps recognition of kindness. Perhaps memory of the young woman who had worked efficiently under his command 2 years ago. Then his face hardened again. He knocked the canteen from her hand with his good arm. Water splashed across the floor. "I would rather die of thirst than accept anything from a traitor's hand," he said. Then he gathered what moisture remained in his mouth and spat directly in her face. April 27th, 1945. 18:30 hours. The spittle ran down Helene's cheek. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The contempt in Hauptmann Brandt's eyes was absolute. This was the world she had known. This was the ideology she had been raised to serve. This hatred, this cruelty, this reduction of human beings to categories of worthy and unworthy. Henry moved before Helene could react. He stepped between her and Brandt, his body language radiating controlled anger. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. Anna translated, though the tone needed no translation. "In this camp, prisoners are treated according to the Geneva Convention. That includes German military personnel. You will receive medical care, food, water, and shelter. You will be treated with dignity, regardless of how you behave. Do you understand?" Brant laughed, a harsh sound that turned into a cough. "Dignity from a Negro. The world has gone mad." Henry did not rise to the bait. Instead, he turned to Lieutenant Mitchell. "Give him the best care available. Use our medical supplies, not just basic provisions. I want him to survive his wounds." Mitchell looked surprised. "Sergeant, after what he just did, I want him to survive," Henry repeated firmly. "I want him to go home to Germany and tell everyone that the Americans who he called animals treated him better than his own officers treated their people. I want him to live with that knowledge." He picked up the canteen that Brant had knocked from Helene's hand. He filled it from the medical station's water supply. Then he set it on the table beside Brant's stretcher. "When you get thirsty, it will be here. No one will force you to drink. No one will humiliate you. You can choose mercy or choose pride. That's the difference between us and you. We give people choices." Henry gently took Helene's arm and guided her out of the medical tent. Outside in the cooling evening air, she finally broke. The tears came in great, heaving sobs. Henry did not try to stop them or tell her to be strong. He simply stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, letting her cry. When the tears finally slowed, Helene wiped her face with the handkerchief Henry had given her days ago. "He was right," she whispered in German. Anna had followed them out and translated. "I am a traitor. I have accepted kindness from the enemy. I have eaten your food, used your blankets, taken your medicine. While German soldiers die, I am comfortable." "You're not a traitor," Henry said through Anna. "You're a prisoner who is being treated according to human decency. That's not betrayal. That's survival." "But I don't just accept it," Helene said, the words tumbling out. "I am grateful for it. I prefer this to what I knew before. I prefer your kindness to their cruelty. Doesn't that make me a traitor to my country?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were measured, careful. "Let me ask you something. If you saw a German soldier treating an American prisoner the way Brant just treated you, what would you think of that German soldier?" Helene considered. "I would think he was cruel, dishonorable." "And if you saw a German soldier showing mercy to an American prisoner, giving him water, treating his wounds, what would you think?" "I would think he was—" Helene paused, searching for the word. "I would think he was good, decent." "Then why is it betrayal when you recognize the same decency in us?" Henry asked. "Why is it wrong to prefer kindness over cruelty? Is loyalty to a nation more important than loyalty to basic humanity?" The question hung in the air between them. Helene had no answer. Everything she had been taught said yes, the nation came first, Germany above all, the fatherland before self. But everything she had experienced in 4 days said no, humanity came first. Kindness mattered more than flags. Mercy was more valuable than victory. That night, lying on her cot with the new wool blanket pulled up to her chin, Helene could not sleep. The other women whispered in the darkness. Frau Weber's voice carried clearly. "Did you hear what happened? Hauptmann Brandt is here. He called the Müller girl a traitor. He was right. She has become too comfortable with the Americans." Other voices murmured agreement. Helene closed her eyes and pretended to sleep, but inside, something was breaking. Not the quick break of a dam collapsing, but the slow fracturing of ice under pressure. She could feel it happening, feel the old certainties cracking. feel the foundation of everything she had believed beginning to crumble. April 28, 1945, 0800 hours. Helene did not go to breakfast. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the other women leave for the mess hall. When the barracks finally emptied, the silence was heavy as stone. Frau Weber's words from the night before echoed in her mind. Traitor. Comfortable with the Americans. Too grateful for enemy kindness. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps accepting Henry's mercy was betrayal. Perhaps the proper thing was to refuse food, reject medicine, maintain hatred despite evidence. Perhaps that was what loyalty meant. But if that was loyalty, what did it make Henry? He was a black man in a segregated army, fighting for a country that refused him basic dignity. Yet he chose kindness over cruelty. He chose mercy over revenge. Was he betraying his own people by not hating the Germans who had tried to exterminate entire races? The questions made her head ache. Nothing made sense anymore. The simple certainties of Nazi propaganda had evaporated like morning mist. But what replaced them? Without the structure of German superiority, without the narrative of racial hierarchy, what was left? Just a confused 20-year-old girl who no longer knew what she believed. At 1000 hours, Private Thomas Keller appeared at the barracks door. He had been sent to check on her. Through gestures and his few words of German, he communicated that Sergeant Lawson was concerned. Helene shook her head. She could not face Henry today, could not face his kindness when she did not know if accepting it made her a traitor. Thomas left, but returned 30 minutes later with Anna. The interpreter sat down on the cot beside Helene. The sergeant wants you to know that no one thinks you're a traitor. What Hauptmann Brandt said was cruel and wrong. How do you know what he said was wrong? Helene asked quietly. You work for the Americans. Maybe you're a traitor too. Maybe we both are. Anna was silent for a moment. Then she said something that had not been translated from Henry. I grew up in Berlin. My father was a university professor who spoke against the Nazis in 1934. They arrested him. He died in Dachau. My mother and I survived by being quiet, by pretending to believe. When the Americans liberated us, I had a choice. I could hold on to hatred for everyone who had remained silent while my father died. Or I could choose to believe that most people are just trying to survive. That most people are trapped by systems beyond their control. She paused, looking directly at Helene. Working for the Americans isn't betrayal. It's choosing a different future. It's deciding that maybe the world doesn't have to be divided into Germans and enemies. Maybe it can just be people. But my brother died for Germany, Helene said, tears starting again. My father believed in the Reich. How can I just abandon what they fought for? Did they fight for Hauptmann Brandt's cruelty? Anna asked gently. Did they fight for the right to spit in a woman's face? Or did they fight because they were told it would make Germany strong, make their families safe, make the future better? Helene had no answer. Anna stood to leave. The sergeant says you can take all the time you need. No one will force you to eat or work or do anything. But he wants you to know something. He says that in Birmingham, when white people did cruel things to his family, his mother always told him that cruelty reveals weakness, not strength. The Hauptmann's hatred doesn't make him strong. It makes him afraid. After Anna left, Helene lay still for another hour. Finally, hunger drove her up. She had not eaten since dinner the night before. Her stomach hurt with emptiness. She made her way to the mess hall, arriving after the regular mealtime. But Corporal Washington, the kitchen supervisor, still had food warming. He served her without comment, without judgment. Just a plate of food and a quiet nod. Helene ate alone at a corner table. The food tasted like ash in her mouth. Everything felt wrong. Not the food or the camp or the Americans, but her. She felt wrong, split between the person she had been taught to be and the person she was becoming. The German girl who should hate the enemy, and the human being who recognized kindness, regardless of its source. That evening, when Henry came to check on her, she could barely look at him. The interpreter was not present. They sat in silence on the bench outside the barracks. Finally, Helene found her voice. In broken English she had been picking up from listening, she said, "I am sorry." Henry looked at her, confused. Sorry? For what? She gestured helplessly, lacking the words in English. So she spoke in German, hoping he would understand the tone, if not the words. "I am sorry for believing the lies about you. I am sorry that my country tried to destroy the world. I am sorry that your kindness makes me feel like a traitor. I am sorry for being weak enough to enjoy being treated like a human being." Henry did not understand most of the words, but he understood sorry, and he understood the pain in her eyes. He took her hand gently. "Nothing to be sorry for," he said in English. "Nothing at all." But Helene knew there was everything to be sorry for. Her country's crimes, her own complicity, the comfortable lies she had accepted, the hatred she had harbored, the world Germany had tried to create, and, most painful of all, the realization that enemy mercy had taught her more about humanity than her own government ever had. April 29th, 1945, 1900 hours. The camp was quieter than usual. Word had spread that American forces were closing in on Berlin. The war in Europe was approaching its end. Within days or weeks, Nazi Germany would cease to exist. The prisoners in Wetzlar camp existed in a strange limbo, suspended between the world that had been and the world that was coming. Helene sat alone in the courtyard, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. She had avoided Henry all day. After her breakdown the previous evening, after her apology that felt both necessary and insufficient, she could not face him. The weight of her country's crimes pressed down on her shoulders like physical force. 6 million Jews murdered, millions of Slavs dead, entire cities reduced to rubble. How could simple kindness from one American soldier balance against such horror? Henry found her anyway. He sat down on the bench beside her without asking permission. For several minutes they sat in silence. Finally, Henry spoke, and Anna appeared from somewhere to translate. The interpreter seemed to materialize whenever needed, as if she understood that some conversations could not wait for morning. "I need to tell you something," Henry said through Anna. "Something I haven't told anyone since I came to Europe. Something that might help you understand why I do what I do." Helene kept her eyes on the sunset. She was not sure she wanted to hear more. Every story Henry told made her own complicity feel heavier. "When I was 19 years old, Henry continued, I watched 3 white men beat my father nearly to death. We were walking home from church. My father accidentally bumped into a white woman on the sidewalk. She dropped her purse. My father bent down to pick it up for her, being polite, being helpful. She screamed that he was attacking her. Anna translated carefully, preserving the pain in Henry's voice. 3 men came out of a store. They grabbed my father. They beat him in the street while people watched. Nobody helped. Nobody called the police. When the police finally came, they arrested my father for assault. He spent 6 months in jail for trying to help a woman pick up her purse. Helene finally turned to look at him. Henry's face was tight with old anger, old pain. When he got out, he was different, broken. He never walked with his head up again. He never looked white people in the eyes. He taught me to be invisible, to be silent, to survive by not being noticed. "I am sorry," Helene whispered. Anna translated. "Don't be sorry," Henry said, his voice suddenly sharp. "That's not why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you because I could have become like your Hauptmann Brandt. I could have let that hatred consume me. I could have decided that all white people were my enemy, that they deserved whatever suffering came to them. It would have been easy. It would have felt justified." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "But my mother taught me something different. She said that hatred is a poison you drink yourself while hoping the other person dies. She said that if I let what happened to my father turn me into a hateful man, then those 3 white men would have won. They would have stolen my soul along with my father's dignity." Helene felt tears starting again. She seemed to cry constantly now. The dam had broken somewhere inside her, and she could not stop the flood. "I don't know how to live with what my country did," she said through Anna. "Every act of kindness you show me makes it worse. Every piece of chocolate, every blanket, every moment of mercy reminds me that Germany chose cruelty instead. My brother died for that cruelty. My father believed in it. How do I honor their memory while rejecting everything they fought for?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were careful, measured. "Maybe you honor them by being better than the system that used them. Maybe you honor them by proving that Germans can learn, can change, can choose differently." "But you don't understand," Helene said, pulling away from him. "You didn't choose the segregation in America. You were born into it. You're a victim of that system. I chose to believe Nazi propaganda. I chose to serve the Reich. I chose to not question. That makes me complicit, not a victim." The words hung between them like a wall. For the first time since they had met, Henry looked angry. Not the controlled anger he had shown to Hauptmann Brandt, but something rawer, more personal. "You think I didn't have choices?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You think every black person in America is automatically innocent? Some of us collaborate with the system that oppresses us. Some of us hurt our own people to get ahead. Some of us choose silence when we should speak. You don't have a monopoly on guilt, Helene." He stood up abruptly. "You want to wallow in your shame? Go ahead. But don't pretend that your suffering is special. Don't pretend that you're the only person who has to live with bad choices." He walked away, leaving Helene alone with Anna and the dying light. The interpreter sat quietly for a moment, then spoke without being asked to translate anything. "He's struggling too. He carries his own guilt, his own anger. Don't mistake his kindness for not understanding pain." That night, lying in her cot, Helene realized something. Henry's anger had hurt, but it had also felt oddly like respect. He was not treating her like a fragile thing that needed protection. He was treating her like an equal who needed to take responsibility. Maybe that was its own kind of mercy. May 1st, 1945, 2100 hours. Adolf Hitler had been dead for 24 hours, though official confirmation would not come for another day. The Reich was collapsing. Berlin was burning. The war in Europe had perhaps a week left. In Wetzlar, these seismic shifts felt distant, almost unreal. The camp routine continued. Meals appeared, work details assembled. The machinery of occupation ground forward regardless of headlines. Helene had not spoken to Henry since their argument 2 nights earlier. She had seen him across the compound, going about his duties, but they had not been alone together. She told herself it was better this way. Their connection had been strange from the beginning, impossible to define, built on a foundation of shared pain that perhaps could not support anything more substantial than brief understanding. But tonight, as darkness fell and the spring air turned cold, Helene found herself standing outside Henry's quarters. It was a small building that housed 4 sergeants, segregated from the white officers even in this remote German camp. She stood there for 5 minutes, trying to find courage, before finally knocking. Henry opened the door. He looked surprised, then wary. Helene? She did not have Anna with her. No interpreter. Just her broken English and his few words of German. She took a breath. "Stay with me tonight," she said in careful English she had been practicing. "Please." The words were the same ones she had spoken that first night, when fear had driven her to beg for his presence. But tonight they meant something different. Tonight they were not a plea from a terrified prisoner. They were an invitation from one human being to another, an acknowledgement that neither of them should face the darkness alone. Henry studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Let me get my coat." They walked through the camp together, past guards who had learned not to question Sergeant Lawson's movements. They sat on their usual bench overlooking the parade ground. Above them, stars emerged in the clear spring sky. The same stars that had witnessed 6 years of war. The same stars that would witness whatever came next. "I need to tell you something," Helene said in German, knowing he would not understand the words, but needing to say them. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me as human when you had every reason not to. Thank you for showing me that kindness is possible, even in the worst circumstances. Thank you for being angry with me, because it meant you expected better from me." Henry did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He reached over and took her hand. Not romantically, not possessively, just 2 people holding on to each other in the darkness. "I'm going home soon," he said in English, knowing she would not fully understand. Back to Sarah and James. Back to Birmingham and segregation and all the fights that are still coming. But I'm going to remember this. I'm going to remember that an enemy became a friend, that hatred can be unlearned, that people can change. They sat together until the stars filled the sky. They did not need words anymore. The silence between them was no longer the silence of fear or confusion. It was the silence of understanding, of 2 people who had taught each other something essential about humanity. When Helene finally stood to return to her barracks, she turned back. "Stay with us," she said in English, then corrected herself. "Stay with me. In here." She touched her chest, over her heart. Henry understood. "Always," he said. 3 weeks later, the war in Europe ended. The processing camp at Wetzlar began releasing prisoners to return to their homes. Helene was reunited with her mother and sister. They found their house still standing, damaged but repairable. Germany was a wasteland of rubble and guilt and uncertain future. But Helene carried something with her that most Germans did not have. She carried proof that mercy was possible, that enemies could become friends, that the cycles of hatred could be broken by individual choices. She joined a refugee organization helping displaced persons, both German and foreign. She worked to rebuild what her country had destroyed. Years later, in 1963, Helene would watch television coverage of the March on Washington. She would see hundreds of thousands of people gathered, demanding equality, demanding justice. And there, among the speakers and organizers, she would see a name she recognized. Henry Lawson, civil rights activist, speaking about the lessons of war, about the power of choosing mercy over vengeance. She would write him a letter. It would take 6 months to reach him. In it, she would say simply, "You stayed with me that night in Germany. You stayed with me through all the years since. You taught me that." Humanity is not about nationality or race or ideology. It is about the choices we make when choosing would be easier to hate. Thank you for choosing differently. Thank you for teaching me to do the same. Henry would write back. His letter would say, "You taught me something too. You taught me that people can change, that forgiveness is not weakness, and that the best revenge against hatred is refusing to become what you hate. Thank you for having the courage to unlearn everything you were taught. Thank you for staying human when it would have been easier to stay broken." Their letters would continue for years. Two people who met as enemy and captor, who became something the world had no proper name for. Not quite friends, not quite family, but connected by the understanding that salvation sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, wearing the most unexpected faces. In the end, what Helene learned in that German prison camp was simple but profound. Mercy was not about deserving, it was about choosing. And sometimes the people we are taught to fear are the ones who teach us how to be fully human. The night she had begged Henry to stay had been the beginning of her transformation. But every night since, she had chosen to stay with the lessons he taught her, to stay with compassion over cruelty, to stay with hope over despair, to stay with the belief that people, even in the darkest times, could choose to be better than the worst versions of themselves. That was the real victory. Not military triumph, but the triumph of one human heart learning to see another human heart, regardless of all the borders and hatred and propaganda that tried to keep them separate. That was what it meant to stay together through the night and into the dawn of whatever came next. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.